Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this MAPA webinar about Colombia. Thank you for joining us. My name is Yoav, and I'm the co-chair of the Latin America and Caribbean Working Group of MAPA. We are doing work to end the US deadly sanction on Venezuela, the US blockade of Cuba, to end the US UN occupation of Haiti, and other struggles as well. We do solidarity work with the poor, the indigenous, the workers, and the oppressed. We support the progressive revolutionary movement in Latin America and the Caribbean. This webinar is the first of two webinars about Colombia that we are organizing. The first webinar today will provide an historical context for the current rebellion in Colombia. The second webinar on July 6th will provide a report from the ground level. The speakers will be Terry Madsen from Code Pink, who went recently to Colombia with an international human rights delegation, and Victor Correa Lugo, who is a physician, professor, and activist from Bogota. I hope that you will join us on July 6th. Of course, I would like to thank the speakers, Angelica Brenel, Andrés Castro, and Kevin Young for taking the time to be with us and enlighten us. Before we start, I would like to introduce you to the action part of this webinar. We have a petition calling on the US to stop military and police aid to Colombia. You and I have spent $10 billion giving Colombia military and police and training support for the last 20 years. Therefore, we have a stake at what is happening in Colombia and a responsibility as well. And therefore, we demand that our government end this policy, apply the Leahy law, which prohibit the sale of US weapons and providing training to military and police forces that are engaged in serious violation of human rights. We want the US to close its bases in Colombia, and we want the US to stop using Colombia as a stage ground for a regime change operation in Venezuela. So I'm going to put in the chat a link to a petition that we have, and we are going to send this petition to all the senators and the congressional representative from Massachusetts, asking them to support this demand that I just listed. So I'm going to give the floor to Professor Kevin Young, who will moderate today's webinar. Take it, Kevin. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. So it's a real honor to have been invited to moderate this presentation and discussion with our two guests. And I thought I would start with just some brief comments to try to contextualize what's happening in Colombia right now. The last few months have seen a real intensification of several interrelated crises that Colombia is facing, that the people of Colombia are facing. And I'll mention three crises. One is the level of state and paramilitary violence in the country that has killed at least 70 unarmed protesters and maybe far more since April 28th, when Colombians began mobilizing in the streets against the regressive tax reform bill that had been put forward by the country's far right-wing neoliberal president, Ivan Duque. These victims since April are the latest among literally thousands of unarmed activists killed by the interconnected apparatus of state and paramilitary death squads since the 1980s. And as Yoav was saying, it bears emphasizing that US support has been absolutely crucial in enabling the Colombian state and right-wing death squads to get away with this. Colombia, since the early 90s, has the distinction of being South America's worst human rights violator, and also by far the leading recipient in South America of US military aid. A second crisis is poverty. And poverty is largely a product of the country's neoliberal economic model, which involves gutting public services like healthcare, deregulating the labor market, and generally prioritizing wealthy capitalists in every aspect of public policy. By the government's own data, 43% of Colombians live in poverty, which of course, especially impacts the country's Black and indigenous populations due to the entrenched structures of white supremacy. In the heavily Black city of Cali, for instance, which has been an epicenter of protest and of repression in recent months, 67% of the population lives in poverty. And it's this economic model that has inspired mass protests, including long before April 28th. The recent protests come amid a third crisis, which of course is COVID. The pandemic has killed about 103,000 people in Colombia to date. And there's been a huge spike since March of this year, as the President Duque has reopened the economy. Colombia has the second highest per capita death toll in the world over the last 7 days. So, you know, the pandemic right now is probably the worst that it's been in Colombia. Almost 4,000 people have died just over the past week. So that's an average of, you know, over 500 people a day. So our two speakers are going to provide us with more context and analysis on the current situation, including what is happening there, what has the Colombian resistance movement looked like, what has it been trying to do, how has it been organizing, what has the role of the United States been, and how are organizers here in the United States and in other countries trying to organize in solidarity with the people of Colombia. So first, we're going to hear from Angelica Maria Bernal, who's a colleague of mine at UMASS Amherst. She is an associate professor of political science. And then we will hear from Andrés Fabián Henao Castro, who is an assistant professor of political science at one of the other UMass campuses, UMass Boston. So they're both based here in Massachusetts. And Andrés and Angelica have both been involved with solidarity work here in the US. So I'm sure they'll have a lot of good insight for us. They're going to kind of alternate back and forth in their presentations. They've coordinated a little bit in advance. So they will speak for 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. During that time, if people want to type questions or comments in the chat box, you can do that. I'll do my best to keep track of those and to present them later on. Generally, the shorter that you can keep your questions and comments, the easier it is to manage from the perspective of the moderator and the people who are trying to respond. You can also ask your question verbally if you want after they're done. We can call on you if you raise your hand using the raise hand function. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Angelica Bernal.
Thank you, Kevin. You can hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you for that introduction. And I also wanted to thank you and MAPA for this opportunity to speak to you all and all of you for attending here. You know, solidarity efforts now more than ever are so necessary and important. I want to begin by noting that tomorrow is the 28th, and that marks the 2-month anniversary of the beginning of the protests, which began on April 28th. And thank you, Kevin, for setting up the context. What I thought we'd do today with my colleague, Andrés Fabián, is that we're going to set up some of the historical context and have an informal conversation so that I think we can better understand what the protest, what is the protest, why it's happening, and what ways everybody can be involved. So I know Kevin set up some of the context, but I also wanted to add a couple of things. I know that you've probably seen the images on the news. You know, sometimes the misnomer is that you see it in English media is called a riot. It's not a riot. It's a strike, a strike. It's the whole of society coming down and staging a massive act of refusal. It's historical and unprecedented. We've seen that the protests have extended not just into a few cities, but throughout. It's a conflagration of people standing up. They've extended to cities not just concentrated in the countryside or in smaller cities, but in Bogota, Cali, Medellin, throughout. The other important thing to note is, as Kevin noted, these protests have been prompted by crises that have long been standing. It's not, that have foundational roots, and that affect millions of people. Colombia, it's important to note, is the second most unequal country in Latin America. In Latin America, already a region that is highly unequal. And this is after being the recipient of the largest amount of aid in amounts of trillions of dollars through PAN-Colombia, which my colleague will talk about more. Now, these protests, which have now lasted for 2 months, have no sign of abating or fizzling out anytime soon. So these also important to note is that these are a continuation of things that have been longstanding. The protests also trace their lineage to protests that began earlier the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, starting in November of 2019. So given that these protests are historic, given that it involved millions of people, that they're spread regionally throughout, and that they have no sign of abating but are continuing to intensify, it's important to understand what the historical context and the political context of this paro, or this strike, is. Now, what we're going to be doing is talking about a few of the historical points to note to understand the paro, not just a contemporary historical points, but sort of longstanding in the history of Colombia. I'll be talking about a couple of those relating to colonialism and to imperialism, some of the historic dates to keep in mind. As if you've been following the paro, you know that some of the groups that have been really protagonists of it have been indigenous groups, Afro-Colombians, and they have been protagonists as longstanding groups that have been a target both of the military, of the violence, and also of the root causes of what we're seeing now with the economic disparities in the country. So I'll talk about that. And then Andrés is going to be talking about some of the other elements, focusing on violence, the armed conflict, the peace protest. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the strike. Why are people protesting? And what are some of the, what's been happening? What some of the processes that are more going on at the moment, which have been really interesting, and that my colleague Andrés Fabián has also been very intimately involved in from the diaspora. So to begin, I just want to begin covering some of the important foundational things to understand about what's been setting up the ground for what's going on today. I mentioned colonialism, imperialism, and we want to note that these things have been longstanding. Colombia, so a couple of dates to note. Colombia was originally Gran Colombia, so it incorporated what we would now consider in the Colombian state of Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, Venezuela, and northern parts of Peru and northwestern Brazil. It declared its independence officially on July 20th, so it's coming up, and I expect that July 20th will be a big day of political action, given that it's the day of independence. So it declared its independence in 1810, but importantly, even though it declared its independence in 1810, and that particularly Afro groups were involved as important ground soldiers for the independence movement for Bolivar, for Simón Bolivar, they were not included as part of that independence. It was an independence by colonial Creole, that is, Creole is descendants of the Spaniard elites, of which Bolivar was one of them. So this independence by no means granted any rights or include indigenous people or the Black populations. Instead, since independence, these populations have experienced enslavement, violence, marginalization, and continued exploitation. To focus on the indigenous population of Colombia, they constitute about 3.4% of the population, with 78% of them concentrated in rural areas, and have been some of the biggest targets affected by the armed conflict. Afro-descendant populations constitute about 10.6% of the population, though census figures have been disputed, and Afro-Colombian leaders have claimed up higher. The country of Colombia has been really riven by racialized regional dynamics, where populations, indigenous populations and Afro-descendant populations have been focused on certain regions, and the urban centers have been primarily mestizo areas. Now, for the Afro populations, I mentioned indigenous populations have been a target of intense violence, marginalization, exploitation. Now, in Colombia, slavery was abolished in 1851, but what is important also to note is that that this abolition also had disparate effects. So the laws varied throughout Colombia in terms of who gained freedom at what different time, and that like indigenous populations, both indigenous populations and Afro populations were affected by these policies called blanqueamiento or whitening policies that were pursued by the early Colombian state to establish a unified, homogeneous state. At the expense of indigenous and Black populations. So these policies were not just sort of like a whitening. There was a disinclusion of citizenship rights and purposeful, ethnocide of populations to disinclude them from the idea of what counted as the Colombian people, land displacements, and other aspects of colonization. So Afro-Colombians and indigenous populations still to this day account for the majority of Colombians that have been internally displaced populations. Now, in Colombia, a big focus has also been on the powers of the executive, which have been extensive. And all of this also traces its roots to the 1886 Colombian Constitution, which was the conservative constitution that replaced a prior liberal constitution of Rio Negro. And in this constitution, a couple of things were important to note. One was the establishment of Catholicism as the official religion, the denial of any recognition to indigenous and Afro-Colombian peoples, and also the extensive rights granted to the president through this constitution. So it was a very strongly centralizing constitution that allowed the president to gain a vast, extensive amount of powers in comparison to the legislature. For instance, by allowing the president to declare rights to declare a state of siege. Now, other populations or other segments of Colombia that you've seen out in the strike have been, for instance, women groups, and importantly, you see that that the part of the Colombian that Colombian women, even though they've gotten the right to vote since 1954, they're working class women, indigenous women, Afro descendants have been not included in sort of the litany of freedoms, because since 54, the freedoms that have been granted have been primarily focused on middle and upper class women. Now, the next state that I want to note is 91. In 1991, Colombia restructured its constitution, established a new constitution that has been lauded throughout the region. I myself am a constitutional scholar, and so you see the Colombian case come out as one of these like ideal typic cases. The Constitution lauded for various reasons. One, substantially for some of the things it gained in terms of formal recognitions of multiculturalism, plurinationalism, things that would later go on to inspire other constitution-making episodes throughout Latin America. It also included things like protection for Black people's ancestral lands through this right of previous consultation that was really innovative. But importantly, the Constitution also, you begin to see in these processes through which the Constitution was established, some of the roots of what we're seeing today as problems. For one, the Constituent Assembly was originated to deal with some of the root causes of the armed conflict. That was the purpose of it. It originated in some of the student movements in '86 and others pushing to have a way to refound society and to deal with some of the causes of mass levels of inequality, exclusion, marginalization, of not having a true democracy, but a partidocracy or strong leaders that were not reflective of the people. And the 91 Constitution was, highly democratic, including vast segments of the population, but also not able to deal with a lot of the root causes. It also, importantly, you saw the demobilization of some groups that had been guerrilla groups like the M19, IPLN, Quintin Lamé. So this, and incorporated them as part of the state, as political parties. And also, the Constitution opened up the terrain for neoliberal policies that would lay the ground to the privatization, the extensive role of private companies and private interest and foreign interest, and the grounding of the neoliberal model in Colombia. So we see that in the legal basis there. For instance, the Constitution created some, so to anticipate the Constitution and later on, to anticipate the Constitution in 90, there were some structural reforms that happened to make the labor market more flexible and open up markets for private investments and to lift restrictions to foreign investments. As well as to incentivize. But in the Constitution, in a couple of articles, this is even given greater ground. So for instance, in the 91 Constitution, in Article 335 and 336, you establish the ability for foreign capital action and participation in the mining sectors to promote privatization and to allow for the push for mega projects. In later on, these neoliberal policies continued, and what you see as part of a lineage you can trace is that regardless of ideological orientation in Colombia, so it's not been just an aspect of conservative versus liberal, but throughout, neoliberal policies have really entrenched themselves. In 92, the government restructured the mining ministry, creating different administrative entities to promote national and foreign investments. And part of this, and you see it throughout the region, is this logic of that through extractive industries and through extractivism will be the road to progress and poverty alleviation. You see it in the slogans that appeared as progress for all through development and through these extractive industries. And what I mean by extractive industries have been things like oil, gold, agro industries. Now, these industries in particular were able to during the international boom of the 2000s and 2010s, these commodities have increased in their price and been able to create to increase the role of companies within the state and the state's interest in a highly securitized and militarized presence in these areas to assure investors of the security of their investments. It also has led to a great amount of land displacement in populations that are within these areas in which companies have intervened. So this has disproportionately affected indigenous and Afro-descendants that have been in these areas that have been sold out as concessions by the state, or that the state has intervened to promote the interest of companies. Now, in the case of the prior president, that the current president, Ivan Duque, traces his lineage, Ivan Duque's lineage is to Álvaro Uribe. Álvaro Uribe's policies were towards establishing this idea of a communitarian state for development of everybody through incentivization of agricultural exports, securities on investments to foreign investments, and increased persecution of the FARC to create a state of law and order. The increase in the mining sector during this period was tenfold. It went from 446 million to 4.5 billion from 2000 to 2010 alone. And in the case of Juan Manuel Santos, which is the next president from 2010 to 2014, you see the continuation of these policies and the continued expansion of the extracted frontier for the sake of gaining investor confidence. And I should also note the increase of other sectors along with gold and oil. Coal production increased by 80%, petro by 36%, and gold by 340%. Last two things I want to mention before turning it over to Andrés, who will discuss then violence, is I mentioned the protagonism of indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, and a couple of things are important to note within this that's also happening in the late 90s and and into the early part of the 21st century. One is these procesos de comunidades negras, or processes of Afro-descendant communities. These are born in 1993 as a response to the violence and as networks of organizations in the Pacific region, focusing on strengthening Afro-Colombians' culture, rights, political participation, economic development, access to resources, engage in consciousness raising, and in fighting discrimination. They constituted about 140 base organizations and have been really critical to articulating the Afro-Colombian demands into the present, and particularly territorial struggles, land displacement issues that have been at the forefront. The other thing to note is the establishment of peace communities in the area of San Jose de Apartado in the northern region. So communities refusing to take a stand against the war and to support any armed actor. So these are communities of peasant farmers that have been dealing with articulating and representing and to fight against land displacement and for the territorial struggle. Now, the other important protagonists in the present and also targets of a lot of violence have been indigenous actors. And indigenous protagonists and the movement in the present has used as an important tool the idea of the indigenous minga, M-I-N-G-A. Now, the idea of the minga that comes from an indigenous word throughout the Andean area for the community coming together to build and reconstruct something for the greater good of all. It reflects these indigenous practices of solidarity and reciprocity. And since the 2000s, Colombia's indigenous movement in the Southwest has begun to organize using the term of the Minga for social and communitarian resistance. Now, these Mingas incorporate indigenous people, but have also been an important force for alliances, collective action by other social movements, such as Afro-descendants, campesino women, trade unions, and others. Now, the goal of the Mingas have been the rejection of the neoliberal model, the destruction of the commons, and focusing on implementation of the 2016 peace accords. Now, the Mingas and the Indigenous Guard have been prominent in the protest. And part of what they have been, along with the implementation of the 2016 accords, been fighting for is also respect for life, democracy, the ending of extractive activities, and forced land displacements. And this work has come at a high price of violence, both extending for now a decade and particularly intensified in the protest. Now, in the first decade of the 21st century, just to give you a sense of just how much violence has been experienced by indigenous communities, more than 1,300 people, indigenous people, have been killed in Colombia alone. So that's 1,300. In the following decade of the 21st century, the statistics are that about in every 3 days, one indigenous activist is murdered in Colombia. Now, with that and some of this context set up, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Andrés Fabián, who is going to be talking about then other two important focus of for understanding the historical context. I've mentioned some of it, but he's going to go into deeper analysis of the violence and the armed conflict and the peace accords, which also frame what are some of the demands. So let me turn it over to Andrés Fabián.
Thanks so much, Angelica. Can you hear me all very well? Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks to you, thanks to Kevin, Brian, thanks to MAPA for the invitation. This is indeed a timely moment to have this conversation. I saw in the chat that Juan Matos is with us. It Indeed, Manu was a very close friend of mine. We are all mourning the loss of Manu, and he was very active with the Comunidad de La Toma in Cauca, with Francia Marquez and with others. So there are very strong connections in Massachusetts to this that go beyond just Angelica and myself. So I'm acknowledging that presence, and I'm very happy to have you here and to also be honoring your son and how significant his work was for us in Colombia and solidarity. And the work of MAPA, I was impressed with all the things that you guys are doing and the connections. I also saw the concern with the speed at which we're talking. You have invited us to do this like very long contextualization, so there's so much terrain to cover that we might be speaking a little bit too fast. And I'm gonna try not to give you like tons of dates and perhaps to try to give you a little bit more of like long trends of processes. But I will be giving you also some dates like my colleague Angelica. Now we named this section the violence, but indeed all that Angelica has already been talking about in a sense is a structural violence of colonialism and imperialism that continues all to our day. But there is something very concrete that we also call the armed struggle. The new, like the most recent version of that armed struggle, normally in political science, we date to the formation of the insurgency of las FARC and ELN in 1964, but one can trace the armed struggle much earlier than that. Another date that is often given is the assassination of Jorge Eliezer Gaitán in April the 9th of 1948. Which triggered what is actually called in the literature the violence because of the severity and the horrifying nature of that violence during the following decade, which was primarily a bipartisan violence. Like we had two main political parties, which were the Liberal and the Conservative Party throughout the whole 19th century, early 20th century, and that violence was orchestrated primarily by those parties. So they decided to create a pact in 1958, which is called the Frente Nacional. Is very similar to work to the connections that you have also wanted us to do to Punto Fijismo in Venezuela. And indeed, there are similar processes in terms of the closure of the political structure to more democratic and progressive forces. And so in that sense, there's some resemblance on what is happening in Venezuela at the time and what is happening in Colombia. And it is basically an elite pact to distribute. So 4 years, the Conservative Party would rule, and then the next 4 years, the Liberal Party would rule. And that closure of the political system generated and inspired also by the Foquismo guerrillero, the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the emergence of insurgency movements in 1964. And then you have other movements that start joining. The Ejército Popular de Liberación, the Popular Liberation Army, emerges in 1967. Then you have the urban guerrilla of M19 in 1970. The indigenous guerrilla is the last one, the Movimiento Armado Quintín Lame that Angelica mentioned in 1984, named after Cauca's indigenous leader, Manuel Quintín Lama. Cauca has been one of the most affected sites of the struggle during the repression of the general strike currently. And something very dramatic changes in the decades of the 70s and the 80s. On the one hand is that you have a new actor, which is narcotraffic, and you have the formation of the drug cartels in the late 70s and their consolidation in the 80s. And the second thing is a counter-insurgency apparatus that starts first with state-led, actually US-supported initiatives within the counterinsurgency, the Cold War-like structure that the School of the Americas, that is, I think now in Georgia, but it was at that time in Panama, starts to support the doctrine of national security that was implemented in the Cono Sur during the dictatorships, and then it was implemented during the conservative rule of right-wing presidents in Colombia, primarily with the Estatuto de Seguridad de Turbay in 1978, where you have the first sort of massive demonstrations of state torture in the Caballerizas del Norte. Vera Grave, which is one of I believe to this day, the only woman commander of an insurgency in the M19 was indeed actually tortured in that place. And in the 80s, a part of that counterinsurgency project is the formation of paramilitary organizations by the Brigada 14 in 1983 in the region of Magdalena Medio, where Las FARC had a quite strong control. And so narcotraffic and the increasing, modalities of state repression that start to target actually civil society that is giving the kind of infrastructural care support system for the insurgency and really start to increase the levels of violence in Colombia in an exponential way. And this has different kind of repercussions. One is that the insurgencies start to contemplate, how to fund their own military apparatus, if they're going to engage in narcotraffic as a reliable source of finance, or if they're going to start a peace process. And some opted for that peace process, which was the case of Quintin Lame, EPL, M19, and others remained in war. So the Constitution of 1991, the peace constitution, is an assemblage of a multiplicity of different views of the country. Now you have the consolidation of a kind of proto-welfare state that is coming from progressive democratic forces, as new democratic mechanisms, but you also have, as Angelica mentioned, the consolidation of neoliberalism and institutions that are, supporting and creating the infrastructure for privatization, the regulation of labor, opening. But you also have narcotraffic, with the extradition right, also involved in that process. So it's a very difficult accord. And it is at the same time that you're signing that constitution, you have Operación Casa Verde, which is the continuity of the war where the state is fighting Las FARC. Now, the 90s is the radicalization truly of violence through a variety of factors. One is the strengthening of paramilitary forces. According to the Minister of Defense in a testimony that he gives in the Congress in 1991, the paramilitary organizations were counted in like 300 members. By the time they demobilized in 2005 with the Peace and Justice Law of Álvaro Uribe Vélez, you're counting them in the thousands. And part of that strength, where they became really national, almost independent organizations that were no longer exclusively related just to the military, even though they continue to have support, infrastructural and ideological support, and continue to this day by the state and by military forces. And there are two phenomena to that. One is their link to narcotraffic, so paramilitarism and narcotraffic start to become increasingly indistinguishable. And the second element is a legalization, an apparatus that gives a kind of legal coverage for the really the exponential increase of big landowners to be able to fund their own armies. And this was created under the law that then Governor of Antioquia, Álvaro Uribe Vélez, in 1995 passed, which was the law of the Convivir, Cooperativas de Seguridad Privada, private security cooperatives, that actually, according to the testimonies of the demobilized members of the generals of the paramilitary organizations in 2005, without that, they would not have been able to reach, let's say, the numbers that they were able to reach. And this is also important because the violence in Colombians and progressive social forces that are trying to fight for democratic openings, for redistribution of wealth, and for the number one cause of the armed conflict, which is still the fact that we have not had a land reform, like the concentration of land and the closure of the political system. If you want to take something out of this webinar, those are the two main sources of the still ongoing armed struggle in Colombia: is concentration of land and wealth in a few hands, and the closure of the political system to more progressive forces. And in between, so most of the violence has been horrific in Colombia. Just to give you a kind of broad estimate, the Observatory of Historical Memory during the peace process that Uribe started with the paramilitary, there was a memory reconstruction unit. Like every single peace process has created one of these. We have one with Las FARC as well. Counts between 1970 and 2015, more than 273,000 people have been killed in Colombia. And forced disappearances, like, so to give you a kind of different sense of the enormity of the violence, the Retic report in 1991 in Chile reports 1,248 enforced disappearances during what was officially declared a dictatorship. In the armed conflict in Colombia from 1970 to 2015, we're talking about more than 60,000 disappearances. Argentina alone, which is the worst case in terms of the enforced disappearances in CONESUR, declares 30,000 enforced disappearances. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the enforced disappearances right now during the general strike to sort of give you a sense of how severe the violence is. And this violence is targeted for the most part. It's civilians. Now, civilians are truly the casualties of many crimes. Now, it's the forced displacement and forced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, torture, and so on. Of those, paramilitary forces alone are responsible of 75% of the killings. So even though all actors officially declare forces of the military, for example, during the first decade of the 2000, the army alone, through what is called the phenomenon with the euphemism of falsos positivos, which is state crimes, like where military would kill peasants and make them pass as if they were combatants from the insurgency in order to get the economic remuneration incentives out of that. The Movise and other important organizations of victims report that in the period of time, the first decade of the 20th century, we're talking about 6,000 of those were reported, and that's just the military. So all the actors, the military, the insurgency, the paramilitaries, and narco-traffic that are not, that are also its own agent, have committed gross violations. But most of those violations have been actually committed by paramilitary organizations. So 90s are, in a sense, both a recrudescence of economic and social inequality as a consequence of the neoliberal policies that were implemented, and a huge increase of the repressive apparatus. And that's that's the legacy to the 2000s. And is that what you're seeing is a huge mobilization of people that are fed up with that and are saying, we're no longer willing to endure this system, and we want a change. Now let's shift to the peace process, and just to transition, because I think we're running a little bit late. This is not the first peace process that has happened, not even with Las FARC. One can trace perhaps the most ambitious peace process prior to that was during conservative governments, one with Belisario Betancourt in the 80s, where the agreement was that Las FARC would slowly transition into political life through the formation of a political party that is called the Unión Patriótica. And the Unión Patriótica was almost exterminated by paramilitary organizations and the military in the 80s. We're talking about, we call it in Colombia a political genocide. We're talking about thousands of people killed, many of them disappear, and many of them that are still alive till today under death threats still. So it's a peace process that is accompanied with a huge state repression, and because those guarantees did not exist, there was one of the reasons that Las FARC didn't join the peace negotiation in 1991. They were aware of those limitations. The second one happens under Pastrana Pastrana is elected in 1998, and that process has a kind of similar structure in terms of it's a peace process that is accompanied with a huge investment on war at the same time that you're declaring peace. So the largest military package today to Colombia was done within the frame of the peace process that Pastrana had started with Las FARC. During his government, they created Plan Colombia. Plan Colombia was $7.5 to $8 billion in military aid to Colombia. In fact, some people claim that the ESMAD, Escuadrón Móvil Antidisturbios, which was created around that time, could not have existed without the kind of funding. Perhaps not directly the funds were to the SMAT, but the liberation of other kinds of funds from a state, the amount of money that the state spends on repression and on military control, were able to recirculate to the creation of the SMAT also at that time. So the process, both of these processes, the process of Betancourt and the process of Pastrana, both of these peace processes included virtually no presence of social movements, of organizations, grassroots organizations, movements of victims, like that. Those were failures, strong failures of both of those processes. And they were also done within a framework that it was clearly that both parties were trying to actually use the peace in order to rearm themselves in waiting for better conditions later on. And that's something that happens during the Pastrana peace process, which then leads to a huge discontent of a lot of the population, and then the eventual election of Álvaro Uribe Vélez that is promising the opposite. Like it's not a negotiated way out of the armed struggle, but it is a military alternative to it. And then the government of Uribe, during that government, we see a variety of things. One is an increasing connection of paramilitary forces with Congress. One of the things that sort of jumps Gustavo Petro to the public arena is him making visible in the Congress the connections. About 30% of the Congress at that time in 2006 had connections with paramilitary organizations, and also the severity of the impunity with regards to the peace and justice law that he passes in 2005 with the paramilitaries. That law would have been considerably worse if it was not because the Constitutional Court actually declared some of its articles unconstitutional in terms of the absolute non-recognition of victims. So not all paramilitary forces demobilized, many remain active. They were rebranded as bandas criminales, but they are the all paramilitary organizations like Águilas Negras, which had played a quite protagonic role also in repression after and during the strike, but also in years prior to the strike in terms of targeting social leaders. So these peace processes have been, attempted again and again. I think Las FARC eventually decided to negotiate with the Colombian government under Santos, in part because of the pink-tide sort of regional conditions that were more with the relative success of the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela. And this was kind of prior to the US-led boycott of that process, and it's, how it has been interrupted in a variety of ways. And the fact that it was no longer Uribe, but it was Santos, which even though it's also a neoliberal inclination from the Liberal Party, it belongs to a kind of different socioeconomic structure that is more the kind of financial mega projects rather than the land owning sort of quasi-feudal structure that Uribe Vélez represents. And indeed, there were discords between them both. Uribe was quite an opposing party of those peace agreements. Now, those peace agreements include some important participation of victims and of social movements, and include a much more serious redistribution of land and a tackling of the original sources that are the sources of the conflict: concentration of land, concentration of wealth, closure of the political system. And what has happened during the presidency of Iván Duque is an undoing of those peace accords. The peace accords suffer a first real throwback with the plebiscite, with a strong confidence of Santos that believed that indeed this was going to be a resounding yes, a miscalculation of the ideological apparatus of the far right wing of disinformation of the community in their ways of characterizing this peace process. And then with the election of Iván Duque and really a throwback of that process. I'm going to leave it there. We're going to move now and zoom in to the strike, and then we'll open it for some Q&A.
Thank you, Andrés. And so just to bring us up to the present about the strike, and I should say, when I came to this country when I was 10 years old. And so when I hear a lot of the history, and I kind of remove myself and sort of look at it as a bunch of dates. I really think this is the history of what my family's experienced, and when it was the period of La Violencia, we lost innumerable amounts of relatives. We left because of the violence in the 80s. And, when you hear as a small child, this lack of opportunities. And then I remember, I would like to say turning on the TV, but I don't turn on the TV. What people being interviewed are saying about why they're striking. And they would say it's kind of like the chickens coming home to roost for everything that's been happening foundationally and even more recently. People talked about older people, I would say not older, but people of my generation who would say, finally, the young people are doing something, because we have faced unemployment for decades. There's just like lack of opportunities and the sense that only a few have them and everybody else has none. So to see that that it's this massive societal upheaval, it's not just before every time any kind of segments of the population would mobilize would be, oh, they're terrorists, they're vandals, they're guerrillas. Those narratives still persist, but it becomes harder and harder as so many segments of the population are coming out, and so many segments of the population are saying enough. And so what are the demands and what's enough? One of the things I want to make clear is that the demands are also very varied. They vary according to different locales. So the demands in Bogota and Cali, and this is why some of the negotiations are also happening on the ground between and within cities, are some sets of demands. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that the demands can vary across locales in Colombia. But that's not to say that there are not some general patterns that we're not seeing about the demands. Throughout, you've heard us talk about disparate inequality, land reform, peace accords, violence, this neoliberalism. I also failed to mention, of course, imperialism and the role of the US government in financing. And we're not just talking about Plan Colombia. Plan Colombian is just another iteration of the Monroe Doctrine that has been present since 1823 and is just the latest consolidation of that. Everything that guided Cold War policy, everything that has guided foreign policy in the US and that has financed this. So this is now all of it just coming into focus for many, many people. Now, to the protests themselves you hear a lot about this committee, the National Strike Committee, the Comité Nacional del Paro, which is the representative body that is negotiating with the government. Although, that I mentioned that there are local demands and local bodies that are themselves dealing with these negotiations. But for the National Committee, I'll highlight a couple of this for the sake of just brevity, and we can go into more detail of things in the Q&A. But the demands that the National Committee has proposed forward for the protest are a series of things. One, the retraction of the proposed law to overhaul the healthcare system and to seek more strengthening of vaccinations against COVID. Another thing is the basic income. So what all prompted this was the attempt to increase taxes by Iván Duque for this Plan Ingreso Solidario, which is a basic income program. The basic income program has been criticized because it only really dealt with, it was a tip of the iceberg. It was like nothing compared to other regional programs that have supported people through the COVID pandemic. And given how much, people in Colombia have been affected statistically, the basic income plan gave people, it only tapped into 3 million of the 55 million people that qualify that. So very underserved program that underserved people. So they're actually looking to make that a real program to really serve people and to not just have sort of a dollars set a month, but like a $243 per month monthly minimum salary to help people during the pandemic. Another demand has been the defense of national production of various sectors. So you've seen as some of the protest activists have been, people involved in agro-production. So bus drivers, like people that transport goods. This is what I'm talking about, like vast segments of the population. And so they're seeking for things like the subsidies and to defend things like food sovereignty, which it seems startling to have to defend a country with so many resources for food, but this is what people are asking for. Another important force in the protests have been young people, and so one of the demands that has matched up to that has been free matriculation, because the cost of education in Colombia is exorbitant. And so there are entities that have served in the past that have been restructured and done away with by Ivan Duque's government. So one of them is to help finance the studies of what we call low-income students, but really it's a vast segment of the population since everybody's been pushed into poverty. And then other things also is to stop the forcible eradication of so-called illegal cultivations, and particularly the use of this chemical called glyphosate that is used when it's aerially applied to crops. That's been a big problem, a big source of health concerns, and so they're asking for the stoppage of use of that. So, and then of course to reject privatization of public industries, which has been happening at a net break speed, and a decree that affect pensioners. So these are some of the demands. The strike has, and I'm going to turn it over briefly since we're going to be running out of time, and we'd like to open up to discussion to Andrés to talk about the processes themselves that have also shaped the strike.
Thanks, Angelica. So I want to tell you a little bit about two things as this concluding remark. One is that there are antecedents to this level of mobilization. The MANE, for example, Mesa Amplia Nacional Estudiantil, was the most important student uprising of the last 5 decades. That was in 2011, and indeed, students are one of the most active, people that are right now in the strikes. But you also have the peasant strike of 2013. You have the civic strike in Buenaventura in 2017, and perhaps the most direct antecedent, particularly with regards to the Comité Nacional del Paro. The origins of that committee dates back to November the 21st, 2019, which was the general strike, which is kind of similar in nature to what we have in April the 28th. It was the unwillingness of the government to fulfill the agreements that were reached in 2019 that led to the strike the strike that just happened, and it was related to Duque's package, the reform, labor, tax, pension, like all of these laws that were quite neoliberal in nature under conditions of COVID that increased poverty quite dramatically and inequality as well. But there are also causes related to repression, the non-demobilization of paramilitary forces, the increased brutality of the SMAT, particularly during that other general strike in 2019. In November the 26th, the SMAT killed 15-year-old Dylan Cruz Medina, and indeed there was a whole investigation about the involvement on the SMAT on that. And so there are both antecedents in terms of mass mobilization, but as Angelica said at the beginning, the mobilizations that we're facing with the general strike are quite unprecedented. This is from the Ministry of Defense, like their own indicators, which tend to be more conservative, is that from the 1,103 municipalities in which the Colombian state is distributed, 1,100, more than 800, you saw some kind of general strike activities, and the activities range from blockades to protests to some kind of artistic take. Like that's another aspect of this general strike, and it's the variety of tactics, which are quite extraordinary. The Ministry of Defense counts more than 30,544 actions, different kinds of actions, just in the first, 15 days of the strike is between April 28 and June 16. And to give you like a sense of the broad mobilization and what is happening. I think there are several things to rescue from that process, which I think are quite important. One is we had never witnessed the level of political mobilization of the Colombian society that this general strike has generated. Like people that before were either politically, like, you know, not interested or quite apathic to what was going on, are now, like, you know, kind of aware a little bit about what these reforms are, about the history, about some kind of connections. So that is huge, like from conservative families to, you know, more progressive, like folks that were not interested are now quite politicized and are engaging in kind of the conversation and in the debate. There is a new development of participatory democracy with the primeras líneas, for example, which is a new tactic to protect the constitutional right to protest in the anticipation of that activists already know that they're going to face brutality from the police. So there's a whole system of front lines followed by second lines, by third lines, that have created this new interesting way of protecting public protest, and family members are engaged on that, and there are the mothers that are in the third line that are supporting their children in the first line, beyond just care work, like, which is also part of what is also going on in this protest. The new emergence of communal potlucks, which are also supplying a kind of mutual aid alternative to the failure of the state to provide, you know, basic access to sustainability of the population. Some of the activists have been said that that in the communal potlucks, it was for the first time that they were actually able to eat 3 meals in a day since the beginning of the pandemic because of its consequences. And the last aspect of that new participatory democracy, which was one of the efforts of the Constitution of 1991, was to open up the, you know, modes and give institutional power to the expression of grassroots social movements, and that was eroded through paramilitarism and repression and neoliberalism in the 90s and 2000. Now we have a reemergence of that through popular assemblies. And Angelica mentioned the Comité Nacional del Paro, but there's also a very important, crucial mobilization of the Asamblea Nacional del Paro, which has connections with local, regional assemblies, and they're trying to figure out how to keep the, you know, an active, mobile protesting, you know, broad grassroots movement in the streets. And you are seeing for the first time as an actual public agenda of national discussion things like police abolition, you know, like the to abolish the SMAT, which is one of the main slogans, like things that were inconceivable perhaps, you know, in prior years, that are now, there are conversations happening with the abolition movement in the US and establishing connections both with what the war on drugs, the repression that it has fueled in Colombia, and how it is also linked to the policing of communities of color here in the US and elsewhere through, you know, different, venom, for example, and other kind of weaponry that is designed by, you know, companies that are based here in the States. And the matrícula cero, like, you know, free gratuitous school, access to higher education, and then recognition of the indigenous Black peasants organizations and their power. The Minga of 2019, Minga of 2013 are converging to this movement. So there is a connection of many forces that are also now refusing the ideological criminalization of protesters that was so insidious during the 90s and during Uribe's government. No, the whole disqualification of this as Castrochavismo and many other things that the government has used in order to, you know, criminalize protesters, that is also changing, and people are no longer just buying into these are urban terrorists, which is the way that the right wing is calling protesters in Colombia. And well, we know even from the Minister of Defense that only in less than 10% of these more than 13,000 actions that were reported, in less than 10%, there was some level of disturbances reported, quite often because of the presence of the SMAT, like quite often because of the action of the state repression, not because of actors that also instrumentalize violence in these conditions because of the normal process and vulnerability of public action as well under a country like Colombia. There are antecedents as well to a new modality of parapolicing, which is not just paramilitaries, but it's like a way of including middle to upper class citizens in areas like Cali in order to support and make sure that they won't be brought to justice because of those actions, as has been documented in Cali and other places. You can trace back that kind of parapolicial formation to even the epoch of what is called officially the violence with the formation of condors, for example, from the Conservative Party in the rural areas. But there are also new modalities of counterinsurgency that are like a sort of mix of shock doctrine style, like a really rapid, massive modality of a strong repression, and then like a forcing of an ideological discourse that also criminalizes the protest. So to give you a sense of like in 2 weeks, this is only 2 weeks from the strike, the NGO Temblores, and in the past, which is the Institute for the Study of Development and Peace, according to the Spanish acronym, reported, this is May the 7th, now the strike starts in April the 28th, and by May the 7th, there were 50 extrajudicial killings reported already, 12 rapes. Sexual violence have also been constantly used, and there are horrifying cases, and more than 548 enforced disappearances, and some of which, some of those folks have been found, and because they have been found, the police then have been claimed that those statistics are incorrect. When unenforced disappearances does not stop being unenforced disappearances for the fact that the police like now identifies that the person that was taken illegally against their will and without any kind of juridical process has now been, released from the custody. And quite often under this process, there has been massive use of torture. There are new things that even these militaries learning, for example, from what happened in Chile, with the use of the new weaponry that is targeting mostly the eyes of the protester, like a way of not killing but maiming the body, and then forcing protesters to have to go into those networks of care that then distract from the ability of other kind of strong mobilizations. So there are a variety of new strategies of repression, and then many of us just to conclude with like sort of international national solidarity, one of the most interesting things that has happened with this strike is the level of international and national mobilization in support of the democratic popular forces that are asking for a change. And many Congress, many Congress person in the States were signing that declaration. There's the initiative even from places like Los Angeles in pushing the Leahy law. So the initiatives like what MAPA is doing, but this is all over the country. There are assemblies in Germany that were taking place just a week ago. So it has been quite interesting to see that level of mobilization. Iván Cepeda, which is a congressman for the Polo Democrático, a leftist political movement, during the impeachment audience for the Minister of Defense, Molano, reported that the repression of the strike, comparatively speaking, he was referring to some statistics that were given by independent NGOs, is the worst right now in Colombia. Like that level, what happened in the first 2 weeks, no government has comparatively reacted with such level of repression as has the Colombian government. I thank you all for listening, and we are more than happy to, take on your questions, and sorry for the extended conversation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Angelica and Andres. We do still have some time for questions. We have 2 in the chat currently, which I can ask. And if anyone else has questions, please do either type them in the chat box, or you can raise your hand by going down to the bottom of your screen and clicking on reactions. And then there's a button within that tab that says raise hand. So I see that we have one person raising their hand now. I will go to the chat box first, and then we'll get to you, John. I think either Andrés or Angelica could address these questions, or you both could. So first of all, what explains the U.S. strategic interests in Colombia? What is at the root of U.S. policy here? And does it have anything to do with the Panama Canal? Are there other concerns of the U.S. government that are driving policy? That's the first question from Yoav. The second question from Frank: what is the role of the organized labor movement? So this is a national strike. What is the role of unions in the strike right now? And if so, if they have played a role, what sectors have been involved? So why don't we take those two first, and then we will continue on. So Angelica, would you like to start?
Sure. So that's a big question about U.S. strategic interest in Colombia. It's also a historical question. So, I mentioned that Colombia before was Gran Colombia, so it was the seat of a lot of, it was one of the first independent countries, the seat of Bolivar's actions during the independence movement. So strategically and geographically, it's been well located. Economically, even during the colonial period, it was the seat of the slave trade and the slave markets in Cartagena. So it was already prior to independence, already an economic center, epicenter. So those are some earlier antecedents to say that politically, it's been long an interest because of the power that Colombia held in the colonial and the early independence period. I mentioned the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. So early on, when the U.S. is establishing its own hegemony, it is tapping into Colombia for these policies that would later under Roosevelt be these good neighbor policies. So it's looking at it as sort of among all the Latin American countries, the contender to really be the force to help consolidate U.S. hegemony. So that's bringing us into the 20th century, and then so the more recent responses, of course, relate to U.S. intervention in the illegal drug trade, and the amount of money that the U.S. has invested in that, seen in Colombia as the source for the transport in the 80s and 90s of production, and as the source of the illegal narco-traffic trade. And then in the 90s, then with Plan Colombia, its invested interest as like Colombia being the source of a lot of military aid. So because of the war, the so-called war on drugs, of which the plan failed and didn't do anything. So the Colombia has been also, because Colombia amongst these countries that started turning left in the early 2000s was the one that remained conservative. It remained sort of the seat against to also rally against Venezuela. And so Colombia has always been that's played that different role of reflector and also helping to consolidate U.S. hegemony, or seen by the U.S. as a place to do that. And more, I mentioned more recently in Venezuela, of course, that's a really important one that continued into the COVID present, and we should add that that's also been a really big issue. So there's many strategic interests that remain.
Maybe I would only add to what Angelica is saying, is that you also have corporations, like transnational corporations that are quite close to the U.S. government, and this is also historical. So the United Fruit Company that became eventually Chiquita, for example, huge interest and huge responsibility for their, even they were found guilty actually in the U.S., but had to pay nothing in terms of their responsibility in Colombia. I believe they were fined for $25 million, if I'm correct, in the U.S. courts. And when it was already Chiquita, Dole has also been named by paramilitary organizations as a funding party in terms of helping them to control access to agro-industrial sites. But indeed, narco-traffic sort of puts more the spotlight in terms of interest of the U.S. in the region. I wanted to take the role of the unions, and thanks a lot for that question, Frank. The unions have been very active, and the unions are a variety. So we have national unions that from peasants to industry, some of the industries that we have still in a country that is not as industrialized as other countries in Latin America. Nonetheless, like national, like the CUT, national, like Central Unidad de Trabajadores, and quite central in the Comité Nacional del Paro. So some of the demands that Angelica mentioned in terms of the regulation of labor, pension, tax reform, like those have been objects of dispute constantly with unions, and unions have been quite active in the more progressive, political parties in Colombia, and quite criminalized and also quite affected by political violence. Is the case, for example, in Ecopetrol, in the Sindicato en Bermeja in the 80s, all the way to the Sindicato against Coca-Cola, also to keep making connections to the US. Like they're quite active. They are quite mobile. In the Comité Nacional del Paro, indeed includes a huge representation of labor unions, also faculty from teachers and from the university as well are also members of these sindicatos of national unions, and they take also an active role. So quite central on pushing for those negotiations and having a voice, quite relevant.
All right, thank you both. Let's go to John. Can we get John unmuted?
Am I unmuted now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I want to thank both speakers. It's been really informative today. I feel a little emotional about it because I had a friend down in Miami who came through after graduating from receiving a medical degree in the German Democratic Republic, who went back to Colombia and was killed during one of those periods that Andrés talked about. I think the unions have also suffered a lot from those violence acts. I remember the nurses union also was very important in the struggle. What strikes me is Colombia, like Chile, which was another one of the hard points of US domination in Latin America, things seem very similar in a certain sense in terms of the mass mobilizations that took place, the development in the barrios and the different parts of the country, of new popular forms that we're talking about transforming the structures. And I wondered if there was much communication between what the processes of Chile, which I don't think has faced quite the same violence as we've seen in Colombia, and the process in Colombia. And I also wondered, are there connections developing between the popular assemblies in, say, Cali and those in Bogota, Medellin? Is there some formation of a leadership that's developing truly national?
Maybe I can start.
Yeah.
Thanks, John, for that. And indeed, it's often hard. Like even when I was hearing, I see that Juan Matos has the hand up, and when I remembered like the Manu, and I remember the how far the struggle has gone, and I was also quite emotional. So I think this is an important thing to register, and is that we sometimes use, like give you the context, but indeed we have friends that are right now in the streets that are protesting under threat of their lives, and it's not like a disengaged, kind of conversation. We are under like a concern for the security and even conditions of livability of many of our friends and comrades there. And so thank you for that. The repression to the unions has been also quite severe. But I'm going to focus on your last question. There are initiatives of the national. So there was one National Assembly that took place 2 weeks ago. I was able to, that one met in Bosa, which is a neighborhood in the south of the capital in Bogota. And there were more than 1,000 people I participated virtually with other folks from international communities. We were more than 900 people in the virtual assembly. And there is one new one being called for next month that is going to take place in Cali. And so there are efforts to coordinate this, and in these assemblies, just to, there are from political movements to student movements to labor unions to NGOs to, the variety of actors that converge is quite extraordinary, and the conversations that are taking place are quite important in terms of a demand and a really the construction of an imaginary of a different kind of country, which is what I think is happening in the process of doing these assemblies. It's an understanding of what others are suffering and learning from their organizational activities, but also a way of we shared quite a lot in terms of not wanting to suffer again from this kind of neoliberal reforms. Angelica, I don't know if you want to take on the other question.
I also want to highlight that this has been a really important learning process for a lot of groups. So I wasn't able to be as involved in the details, but I also participated briefly in the virtual community. So I see that there's been a lot of strengthening of the diasporic community. And that I get notices all the time of processes that are happening at the local levels. There's a recent one that's going to be happening in Cartagena, where I'm from. So there's an attempt to have the movement not disarticulate itself, which is to say that just have it sort of be top down and be vertical and not related to the basis. There's a real reflexivity going on right now of taking in this moment and learning from the past, because the moment is ripe for significant change and we don't want to make the mistakes. So there's attempts to really articulate assemblies at the local levels and then articulate those demands with the higher levels. So when we talk about popular assemblies, it's like a whole constellation that is really innovative, that's emerging, that is incredibly just exciting to see. They also faced a lot of concerns in terms of attempts to sabotage. There was attempts to sabotage within the Zoom assemblies. There's possibilities of information of people being released and people being at risk for their participation. So this is not to say that this is happening lightly, but people are still in unprecedented numbers going there and really trying to articulate different demands. And, it includes a lot of even very, very local community organizations of artisans from, neighborhood that I recall in Cartagena, artisans organizing and representing themselves. So it's really amazing that articulation is going on. So it's a truly attempt to really make this into a real, not just a vertical process, but a real horizontal and diffuse process, which is also the strength of what it's been. Is that it's really diffuse, because then you can't just take down sort of the leadership or attack the leadership and then take it down just because it's labor, because of the attacks that labor have had. And because I should say that the Comité Nacional has been headed by a lot of labor organizations, but the bases are a wide variety of sectors, not just labor.
Great. Thank you very much to you both. We are just about out of time. I think we have enough time for one more question, and that's going to be from Juan.
Thank you so very much for having this important meeting, bringing us an update about the social issues in Colombia, a beloved country for all of us. Thank you, Andrés and Angelica, for the solidarity in terms of Manuel. I'm wondering if you guys might consider having a document and send it to the U.S. representative and senators. We may have some voices that would be willing to look at the situation and having a kind of an impact on what is happening, probably. I just want you guys to consider that. And thank you all for having us.
Yes, Juan, and indeed, like, you know, both Angelica and I, we're participating in a variety of actions that go from putting pressure to Congress people here in the US for the legal law and stopping, like what also MAPA is doing, to investigating some of the connections of police brutality and weaponry that actually link other imperial processes that is also about the Palestinian struggle, but it's also about policing of communities of color here in the US, but it's also about the war on drugs in Mexico and in Colombia. And John, I wanted to tell you something about Chile, because I think we left that question a little bit on the, so if I have a few minutes, and is that indeed the shock doctrine and the theory of the shock doctrine traces kind of its origins into the dictatorship in Chile. Now that kind of imposed short-term brutality and then a package of neoliberal reforms. And Chile represented a democratic alternative to the revolutionary process of the Foquismo in Cuba in 1959. It was like, well, maybe we can, you know, one option to have a kind of broad social transformation is an armed struggle, but then there is another alternative, which is like, maybe we can do it through the electoral path, which I think Salvador Allende's government was so terrifying in part because of that, because this was a democratic alternative, which was what the pink tide opened up regionally with the election of Lula, Kirchner, Evo Morales, and obviously the Bolivarian revolution of Chavez. So I think Las FARC was noticing this, that it was harder for, you know, US to destructure these democratic processes in ways that are actually quite similar to what happened in Chile. The first attempt to destructure the democratic socialist process in Chile was through an staged boycott of food industries, and they did the same thing in Venezuela. And one could anticipate that, you know, this would be something that one would see, and movements would have to find ways of working around in the event of the discontent currently with the ruling class in Colombia of making an electoral possibility for a national, you know, progressive leader, if one of these ones that are right now competing and potential candidates in the next election, is that we already anticipate that this would be one strategy of reaction. So there are many things learned from Chile, particularly with the student movement, the communication of both student movements in universities and high schools, because the movement in Chile actually started in la secundaria, in high school, have been huge, and there have been learning process about that. There have been learning process about how to counteract the media, you know, the demonization of the violence in the protest by the state. So yes, those lessons and those communications do exist. Thank you all for listening.
Yeah,
Thanks,
yeah.
Kevin, for moderating.
Thanks,
Okay,
Kevin.
yes, thank you, everyone. I think it's time for us to close now, but I want to direct everyone's attention to the links that Angelica and Yoav have put in the chat in the last few minutes. Be sure to check out those petitions and stay in touch with MAPA for more opportunities to be involved. Yoav, would you like to have the last word?
Yeah, I just want to invite everybody to join us again on July 6th to hear from the ground from Bogota. And I want to thank everybody for joining us on this nice Sunday. And great appreciation for our speakers. Thank you so much. And thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you for this invitation.
Thank you all.